So in this video, I want us to discuss whether law can be used to achieve gender equality in Kenya, noting, the main challenges to this. Now, somebody once said that law cannot bring about social change in Kenya because it has too many limitations. So I want us to analyze this statement with regard to the so-called one-third gender rule in the Constitution of Kenya 2010. Now, the statement that law cannot bring about social change in Kenya because it has too many limitations reflects a skeptical view of law as an instrument of social engineering. However, Kenya's constitutional framework, especially the one-third gender rule, demonstrates that law can drive gender equality, although it faces significant implementation challenges. Now, the key question is whether constitutional law is merely symbolic or genuinely transformative in achieving gender equality. Now, let's look at the constitutional basis of gender equality in Kenya. You see, the Constitution of Kenya 2010 strongly entrenches gender equality. If you look at Article 27 of the Constitution of Kenya on equality and freedom from discrimination, this article addresses a number of issues. It addresses equal protection and benefit of the law, and also prohibits discrimination based on sex or gender. Article 81B on the one-third gender rule states that not more than two-thirds of elective or appointive bodies shall be of the same gender. Article 10 on national values addresses equality. It addresses inclusiveness and also non-discrimination. Now, these constitutional provisions show that gender equality is a constitutional obligation, not just a political choice. Now, what is the meaning of the one-third gender rule in the Constitution of Kenya 2010? You see, this rule requires that no gender should occupy more than two-thirds of public positions, so that at least a third representation must be of the opposite gender. So that if you have, for example, a parliament made up of 150 members, then at least 50 should be male or 50 should be female, and that not more than 100 should be either male or female. Now, the purpose for this is to correct, historical marginalization of women, and also to promote, inclusive governance and enhance, democratic legitimacy. Now, can law achieve gender equality? First, I want us to look at law as a tool of social change. And this is actually the pro-equality view and whether this can achieve gender equality. Now, this legal theory, that is, law is a tool of social change, supports the idea that law can transform society. In fact, Roscoe Pound described law as social engineering, so that law achieves gender equality by creating binding obligations, empowering courts to enforce rights, and compelling institutional reforms. Now, let's look at a few case laws in relation to law as a tool of social change. And the first case is on enforcement of gender principle. And here we have the case of Trusted Society of Human Rights Alliance versus Attorney General. And the facts of this particular case were about appointment of public officials, which was challenged for lack of compliance with constitutional standards. And the issue was whether constitutional principles, including equality and integrity, are actually enforceable. And the ruling that constitutional values are binding and justifiable. And the application of this particular case was that the court affirmed that constitutional principles must guide appointments. And the conclusion of this case was that constitutional values are enforceable. Now, the significance of this case is that law can enforce constitutional equality principles and it can do this especially in governance. The second case is on gender equality in inheritance. And here we have the case of Rono versus Rono. And the facts of this case were that daughters were excluded from inheritance under customary law. And the issue was whether discriminatory customs were valid. And the rule is that Article 27 of the Constitution guarantees equality. And the application of this particular case was that the court invalidated discriminatory practice. And the conclusion of this case was that there must be equal inheritance rights. Now, the significance of this case is that law directly corrected gender inequality in family property rights. Now, the third case is on social economic empowerment. And here we have the case of Mitubel Welfare Society versus Kenya Airports Authority. And the facts of this particular case was forced evictions, affected vulnerable households, including women. And the issue was whether evictions violated constitutional rights. And the rule is that there is right to housing and dignity under Article 43 of the Constitution of Kenya 2010. And the application of this case was that the court held that the evictions were unconstitutional. And the conclusion of this case was that the state must protect vulnerable groups. Now, the significance of this case is that law protects women's socioeconomic rights, hence enabling equality. So what are some of the challenges to achieving gender equality through law? You see, despite strong constitutional provisions, implementation is still weak. Now, the first challenge to achieving gender equality through law is political resistance. You see, the one-third gender rule has faced repeated failure in Parliament, so that courts have even had to issue advisory opinions due to legislative inaction. In fact, at some point, the former Chief Justice Maraga was so upset with this consistent failure to the point that he did a press conference to tell the then President Uhuru Kenyatta to dissolve Parliament due to failure to achieve the one-third gender rule. Now, the second challenge to achieving gender equality through law is weak enforcement mechanism. So that even though Article 81B of the Constitution is mandatory, stating that not more than two-thirds of elective or appointive bodies shall be of the same gender, compliance has not been fully achieved. And we haven't had, consistent sanctions for this kind of failure. The third challenge to achieving gender equality through law is cultural and patriarchal norms. So that deep-rooted customs, limit women's participation. And examples are, inheritance traditions and also leadership bias. The fourth challenge to achieving gender equality through law is judicial reluctance. And in some cases, courts sometimes avoid direct enforcement, preferring advisory approaches instead. The fifth challenge to achieving gender equality through law is institutional barriers. You see, political parties, fail to nominate women equally, and they even lack internal enforcement mechanisms. The seventh challenge to achieving gender equality through law is economic barriers. You see, most women face limited campaign financing and unequal access to political networks. The eighth challenge to achieving gender equality through law is constitutional litigation delays. You see, gender equality cases often take long to resolve, and this actually reduces impact. Now, let's look at the judicial interpretation of the one-third gender rule. You see, the courts have acknowledged the rule is as binding, but have consistently struggled with enforcement. We have the key advisory opinion, which is an illustrative case. And in the matter of the principle of gender representation in the National Assembly and the Senate, the facts of this particular case were about, the question on implementation of the one-third gender rule. And the issue was whether Parliament was constitutionally obligated to implement it immediately. And the rule was, constitutional provisions, are binding. And the application was that the court acknowledged obligation but gave legislature, time to comply. And the conclusion of this case is that the rule is binding, but implementation requires, legislative action. So the significance of this case is that this case, shows tension between legal obligation and political reality. So, does law really work? I want us to carry out a critical evaluation of whether law actually works. Now, the first thing is on the strength of law. Now, there is no doubt that law has created, enforceable equality standards. You see, law has empowered courts and also provided legal remedies. Now, the second thing is on the weakness of law. So that as much as law has been strong enough to empower courts, enforcement is inconsistent, and there is also strong political resistance, and also cultural norms still persist. The third thing is the realistic perceptive on whether law actually works. You see, law in books is not equivalent to law in action, so that even strong constitutional provision may fail without political will, without institutional capacity, and without societal acceptance. Another perspective on whether law works is the sociological perspective. Roscoe Pound stated that law must align with social interest to be effective. Now, gender equality law struggles where society resists change, and especially in Kenya, where we have seen, consistent, resistance to change. So here's the overall assessment. The statement that law cannot bring social change is inaccurate, but partially reflective of reality, in that law can achieve gender equality because it is constitutionally entrenched, so that courts can enforce it, and it also creates, binding obligations. But law is limited because there are implementation gaps, and also there is cultural resistance which still persists, and also we have, political enforcement which is still weak. You see, the conclusion is that law in Kenya is powerful, but an imperfect tool for achieving gender equality. The one-third gender rule in the Constitution of Kenya demonstrates that law is capable of driving, social transformation by mandating inclusion and equality. Cases such as Rono versus Rono and Little Bell Welfare Society versus Kenya Airports Authority show that courts can enforce gender-related rights. However, persistent challenges such as political resistance, weak enforcement, cultural norms, and institutional barriers limit full realization of gender equality. Therefore, law can achieve gender equality in Kenya, but only when supported by political will, by institutional enforcement, and by societal transformation. My name is Biketi. If it is your first time here, make sure to follow this channel and to subscribe for more legal lessons.